At exactly 6:47 a.m. Eastern Time this morning, an encrypted diplomatic alert moved through secure channels in Washington, Ottawa, and NATO headquarters in Brussels. Within minutes, senior officials realized they were witnessing something almost unthinkable. The United States had delivered a 36-hour ultimatum to Canada over control of a newly mapped Arctic energy corridor. A frozen region intelligence analysts now estimate may contain more than $11.8 trillion in untapped natural gas, rare earth minerals, and strategic lithium reserves. If that deadline expires without a breakthrough, the consequences could unfold with shocking speed. Energy markets could react within hours, Arctic shipping lanes could become militarized, and the closest strategic partnership in North America could suddenly fracture over the most valuable resource frontier discovered in decades. What makes this moment even more unsettling is how little attention it is receiving right now. Turn on most major networks and you will barely hear a word about it. According to policy sources monitoring the negotiations, mainstream media outlets are already running nearly 3 hours behind the reality unfolding behind closed doors. And that delay matters because the clock is already ticking on a 36-hour countdown that could redefine control of the Arctic and test the stability of the Western alliance itself. So before we break down exactly what triggered this crisis and what may happen next, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications because the next 48 hours could determine whether the Arctic becomes the world's next energy superpower or the spark of a geopolitical shock no one is prepared for. In this analysis, I'm going to walk you through exactly how this Arctic energy confrontation between the United States and Canada escalated so quickly, and why the next 36 hours may determine who ultimately controls one of the most valuable strategic resource zones on the planet. First, I will explain the 3 key demands reportedly contained inside Washington's ultimatum and why each of those demands targets Canada second. We are going to break down the massive economic consequences if this dispute spirals further, because analysts believe the Arctic reserves at the center of this standoff could influence global energy prices, rare earth supply chains, and North Atlantic security for decades. Third, I will reveal the quiet geopolitical pressure building behind the scenes, including how NATO partners, European energy markets, and private investment groups are already reacting to the possibility of a major rupture between 2 of the West's closest allies. And finally, we will examine 3 possible scenarios that could unfold once this 36-hour deadline expires, each of them carrying consequences far beyond the Arctic itself. To understand why this Arctic confrontation has escalated so quickly, we need to break the situation down systematically, because despite how sudden this ultimatum appears, the foundations of this crisis were laid years ago, buried beneath ice sheets, geopolitical calculations, and a rapidly shifting global energy map. Let's examine the key components driving this confrontation. Evidence 1. The Arctic resource discovery. The first and most explosive factor is the resource discovery itself. Over the past 18 months, a joint network of geological surveys conducted by North American and European energy firms quietly mapped a previously underestimated Arctic basin stretching across portions of the Beaufort Sea and northern Canadian territory. According to preliminary estimates circulated among energy analysts, the basin could contain up to 320 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, along with substantial deposits of lithium, cobalt, and rare earth elements essential for advanced batteries, AI hardware, and defense systems. To put that into perspective, the potential market value of those resources is now estimated at roughly $11.8 trillion over the next 3 decades. That number alone changes the strategic equation. Former U.S. Army General and NATO strategic advisor David Petraeus once warned in a policy forum that control over critical energy corridors in the Arctic will define geopolitical influence in the 21st century, just as oil fields shaped the 20th. If that projection proves correct, whoever controls this corridor doesn't just control energy supply. They control leverage over entire industrial sectors, from electric vehicle manufacturing to advanced computing infrastructure. That reality is exactly what has transformed a quiet geological discovery into a full-scale strategic confrontation. Evidence 2. The energy security shock. The second factor driving urgency in Washington is energy security. Over the past 5 years, Western economies have experienced repeated disruptions in global energy supply chains, from geopolitical tensions in Eastern Europe to fluctuating shipping access through the Red Sea and Indo-Pacific routes. Those shocks force policymakers to rethink a fundamental question: where will the next stable energy frontier come from? Increasingly, the answer has pointed north. According to internal projections from several transatlantic energy policy groups, Arctic extraction could supply as much as 14% of North America's natural gas demand by 2040. Even more importantly, the rare earth minerals embedded in that region could dramatically reduce Western dependence on overseas supply chains for advanced technology manufacturing. Legendary investor Warren Buffett once remarked during an energy conference that whoever secures reliable access to long-term energy resources will quietly shape the economic balance of power for generations. If the Arctic basin truly holds the reserves analysts believe it does, then the stakes extend far beyond one bilateral dispute. They reach directly into the long-term architecture of the global economy, and that is precisely why Washington's ultimatum carries such weight. Evidence 3. The strategic corridor. The third element, often overlooked in mainstream discussions, is geography. The newly mapped corridor sits along a shipping pathway that could become dramatically more accessible as Arctic ice coverage continues to recede. In other words, this region is not just valuable for what lies beneath the ice. It is also critical for how energy and minerals would be transported to global markets. Energy logistics experts estimate that a functioning Arctic extraction route could shorten certain shipping distances between North America and Europe by up to 30% compared to traditional southern routes. That logistical advantage would transform the Arctic from a remote frontier into a central artery of the global energy network. Former Canadian Supreme Court Justice Beverly McLaughlin, speaking at a constitutional law symposium on Arctic sovereignty, once emphasized that the legal framework governing northern resources will become one of the defining jurisdictional questions of this century. Which means the dispute we are seeing today is not simply about energy. It is about who writes the rules governing the next strategic corridor of the global economy. And that brings us to the fourth and perhaps most revealing factor behind this crisis. Evidence 4, the financial pressure. Behind the diplomatic tension lies an enormous wave of financial interest. Private investment funds, sovereign wealth funds, and major energy corporations have already begun positioning themselves for Arctic extraction opportunities. According to estimates circulating among infrastructure investors, developing a full Arctic resource network, including drilling platforms, ice-class shipping fleets, and processing facilities, could require more than $935 billion in capital investment over the next 20 years. That level of capital commitment means whoever gains early control of the corridor could lock in decades of industrial advantage. At this point, I want you to pause for a moment. Because once you begin to see how these four forces, resource value, energy security, strategic geography, and financial pressure, interlock with each other, the seriousness of this confrontation becomes much clearer. If you are starting to understand the magnitude of what is unfolding here, take a moment to hit the like button, because this situation is far more complex and far more consequential than most headlines will ever explain. And with the 36-hour deadline continuing to tick down, the question now becomes unavoidable. What happens when the clock runs out? Now we arrive at the most critical question in this entire situation. What happens when the 36-hour deadline expires? Because once that clock reaches zero, policymakers in Washington and Ottawa will be forced to make decisions that could reshape the geopolitical balance of the Arctic for decades. Right now, analysts inside energy markets and diplomatic circles generally see three realistic scenarios that could unfold. Scenario 1, full compromise. In the first scenario, both sides step back from the brink. Canada could agree to a joint development framework that allows U.S. energy firms partial access to the Arctic corridor while preserving Canadian sovereignty over the territory itself. This kind of agreement would likely include shared extraction rights, coordinated infrastructure development, and long-term revenue sharing between American and Canadian companies. If this happens, markets would probably stabilize quickly. Energy investors would interpret the agreement as a sign that the Western Alliance can still coordinate strategic resource management. Arctic development would accelerate, but under a cooperative framework rather than a competitive one. This would be the most stable outcome, but also the most politically delicate. Both governments would need to convince their domestic audiences that they did not surrender strategic control. Scenario 2, partial compliance. The second scenario is more complicated. Canada might accept some elements of Washington's demands while rejecting others. For example, Ottawa could allow expanded American investment in Arctic extraction infrastructure, but maintain strict regulatory authority over shipping corridors and mineral licensing. On the surface, this compromise might appear workable, but beneath that surface, tensions could remain unresolved. Competing regulatory structures, overlapping commercial interests, and political pressure from both sides could create a prolonged strategic rivalry across the Arctic region. In this case, the crisis would not end with the 36-hour deadline. Instead, it would evolve into a long-term geopolitical competition inside what was once one of the most stable alliances in the world. And that leads us to the third and most disruptive possibility. Scenario 3, strategic breakdown. In this final scenario, negotiations collapse completely. If Canada refuses the ultimatum and Washington responds with economic or energy countermeasures, the consequences could ripple across global markets almost immediately. Arctic infrastructure projects could freeze overnight. Energy investors could pull back billions of dollars in planned development. And NATO itself could face uncomfortable questions about how alliance partners handle disputes over strategic resources. Energy strategist Daniel Yergin once observed that major shifts in global power often begin with seemingly narrow disputes over resource access. If this crisis follows that pattern, the Arctic could quickly transform from a frozen frontier into one of the most contested geopolitical regions of the 21st century. And that possibility is exactly why the next few hours matter so much. So here is the reality of where things stand right now. A 36-hour clock is ticking. Two of the closest allies in modern history are locked in a high-stakes dispute over an Arctic resource corridor potentially worth $11.8 trillion. And the outcome of this confrontation could determine who controls one of the most strategically important energy frontiers on the planet. For decades, the Arctic was viewed as a distant, frozen boundary at the edge of global politics. But that assumption is now collapsing. As ice retreats and new resource corridors emerge, the region is rapidly transforming into one of the most valuable geopolitical arenas of the 21st century, which means this dispute is about far more than a single ultimatum. It is about who sets the rules for the next era of global energy power. And the clock is still counting down. So now I want to hear from you. Do you think Washington pushed too aggressively in this situation? Or do you believe Canada is risking a much larger strategic opportunity by resisting cooperation? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. And if you want to stay ahead of developments in global power politics, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next chapter of this Arctic crisis may unfold sooner than anyone expects.